The Coffin Ship by Bill Wesley. This story appeared in the January 1960 issue of Science Fiction Stories magazine and did not reappear in print until 2011 with an anthology entitled Science Fiction Gems, Volume 1. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. The Coffin Ship. Cy Munson's first awareness was of a faint whirring sound coming through miles and miles of cotton. He struggled to dissolve the cotton, then there was nothing but space, limitless black space, and the whirring sound coming from somewhere beyond. He sent out long tentacles, searching, listening, feeling. Nothing but space. He pulled them in, sent them out in other directions. Nothing but space. Space and the whirring sound. Nothing else? Yes. There was something, a faint light, like a distant star. He sent a tentacle toward the star. It was spinning, blinking, like a sun with one black side, rotating. It grew larger. He drew in his tentacles. He could see it clearly now. It wasn't a sun. It was a light, a yellow, blinking light, and it was right over his chest. He closed his eyes tightly, then opened them again, concentrating on the light. It stopped blinking, and he saw that it was a push button. Under it was a printed sign. Munson strained his eyes, his brain, and slowly read the words, "Push this button immediately upon awakening." He tried to flex his fingers. They seemed lifeless, as did his arms. He twisted his body to see he was free. He felt nothing. No bonds, no clamps. He forced his fingers to move, only a little at first, then more as his blood circulation picked up. Slowly, he bent his arm at the elbow and placed his index finger on the yellow button. Then, summoning all his strength, he pushed. A softer, brighter light came on all around him, and the yellow light went off. He saw other push buttons and other printed signs, and he saw the walls of the coffin. He moved his head from side to side, checking his physical coordination and looking for the source of the whirring sound. A faint breeze stirred against his cheek. It came from a vented opening beside him. The whirring was the sound of an air conditioner. Slowly and with great effort, Cy Munson read the other printed signs. "Lie still until you feel strength in your muscles. Talk to yourself if you like. Try not to sneeze or cough. Regulate temperature with this dial. Do not become impatient. Automatic controls have already been triggered. If you are the first to awaken, there will be a delay of 15 minutes while the outside chamber is brought up to living conditions. You will be released automatically when it is safe. This is a third-level compartment. When released, you will find yourself 4 feet above the floor. Watch your step. Emergency button. Depress only if you feel extreme discomfort or if 30 minutes has elapsed since pressing yellow button." 30 minutes? How would he know? He had no watch. Was he supposed to count? He could hardly think. Where the devil was he, anyway? Vaguely, Munson remembered climbing aboard the spaceship. He remembered the crowd, waving, the television cameras, old Beanpole Simpson smiling at him from the speaker's platform. Gradually, memory came to him, then realization. He was in a spaceship bound for where? What the dickens was the name of the place? Capella. That was it. Supposed to be like the sun, and with planets, the scientists said, at least 3, maybe more. And it was going to take 60 years to get there. That explained the suspended animation, but why Cy Munson? He was no scientist. He had even had a rough time with Physics 1A while squeezing through NU on his football scholarship. How the devil had he gotten mixed up in such a deal? Then he remembered Simpson again, the managing editor of the Chicago Planet. Remembered the day he had gone ranting through the city room shouting, $1,000,000 down the drain. $1,000,000 we bid for an exclusive, and not even a single reporter passes the physical. What a bunch of soft-bellied, whiskey-guzzling, night-owling... He had stopped when his gaze had lit on Cy. "You there!" he had shouted, letting his eyes wander over Cy's thick muscles and clean, tight skin. "What do you do? What's your name?" Cy told him. "Munson, sir. I work in circulation." "Ever do any reporting?" "Don't answer. Neither has anyone else for the past 50 years. Get over to the Space Force Development Center and tell them you're from the Chicago Planet, and pass that physical or you'll never work another day on this paper, or any other paper." Well, that was how he happened to be on the ship. He remembered that much, and he remembered the shot in the arm before being laid to rest in the coffin. But what had happened to the 60 years? It couldn't have... Why, it had only been a minute, like a Sunday afternoon nap after reading the comics, if that was all there was to it. He glanced around the tight little compartment curiously, looking for some indication of time. He didn't know what. A calendar wouldn't do any good unless it was some kind of automatic thing. His eye caught a moving dial, a clock with a minute hand and a second hand. 4.5 minutes, it read. The elapsed time since he had pushed the yellow button, he guessed. If so, he was in for a long 15 minutes. 60 years, just like that. Munson tried to snap his fingers. Didn't do too well. Monk and Johnny and Greased Granson, all the rest of them, 80, 85 years old already, back there on Earth. Some of them dead, probably. His mother and father, for sure. How about Lori? No, that was impossible. Funny little Lori, with the cute nose and that pert little body. She couldn't be 80 years old. She'd never be 80 years old. What a stupid nightmare. He tried not to think of his parents, though both of them had urged him to go. "It's as much your job as anyone's," his father had told him. "It isn't easy to understand why these things are important, but man has to keep going, keep doing, keep learning. The last man in the universe will die wondering what to do next, I guess." His mother had simply said, "Good luck, son. Try to remember at least some of the things we taught you." And Lori? How had Lori taken it? She hadn't believed a word of it. "Well, go on," she had said, gaily, wrinkling her nose at him. "But when you get tired dating those two-headed, furry-skinned Capellans or whatever they are, don't come dialing my phone number again. I'm not playing second fiddle to some alien Ubangi." 6.5 minutes. Oh, that crazy clock can't be right. Cy Munson's voice sounded strange, thin, as if it weren't all there. He tried again. "Damn old beanpole," he shouted. That was better. Had a ring to it. Made him feel good, too. Say, maybe I'll be the first guy awake. Should have had a pool on it. $10 each. 18 guys, that'd be... Make it 100 each. $1,800. Wow! Have a deal at Vegas on that. What would it really be like? He wondered. Would they actually find a planet to land on? Something like Earth? With land and water and animals and people? Oh, that was ridiculous. He didn't know why it was ridiculous. It just was. Capella was a star. Even if it had planets, they'd be way up in the sky. How the devil could there be people and animals and trees and things way up in the sky? It just didn't make sense. Probably find... What the dickens would they find? He hadn't the faintest idea. One look at the Astronomy 1 textbook, and he had beaten a line for jazz appreciation. 3 units was 3 units. Anyway, the astronomy class had met too early in the morning, and they had scheduled some overnight field trips, one of them for the weekend of the Notre Dame game. Wow! Wouldn't that have been something? How come you didn't play in the Notre Dame game, Munson? I was out looking at stars. 9 minutes. He twisted his head around to see if there were any signs he had missed. Ought to have a Coke machine in here, he mused aloud. Then he said, "Hey, I'm hungry. Feel like I haven't eaten for a week." He wondered what Earth would be like when they returned. 120 years and 6 months. 6 months in the Capella system. 120 years commuting. That ought to be a record. Wow. What if we do find people there? Humans. Guys like me and a gal like Laurie. Munson squirmed. No, he'd never find another one like Laurie, not on a stupid yellow star. He didn't have to be an astronomer to know that much. 11 minutes. He was going to be first, unless somebody made it in the next 2 or 3 minutes. Ought to be a special prize for the first guy awake. Extra glass of champagne, at least. That was the last thing he remembered before being shoved into the coffin. "Champagne and caviar on Capella 3 when we wake up," Captain Halloran had said. "Goat's milk, you mean?" someone else had said. Everyone except Cy had laughed at that. If it was a joke, he had missed it. Those scientists and Space Force boys had their own brand of humor. 13 minutes. He hoped his typewriter was okay. It had better be. Old Beanpole would give him... He caught his breath. Old Beanpole Simpson was dead. Long dead. 30 or 40 years dead. Cy felt a lump in his throat without understanding why. He hadn't even liked the guy. Domineering old bastard. "Go," he had shouted. "Of course you'll go. The reputation of this paper depends on your going. You represent $1 million investment. Do you know how many words Shakespeare would have had to write to make $1 million? Don't answer. I know. Who's Shakespeare? Just write what you see and what you feel. Don't lie. Don't exaggerate. Don't let any man in the world, not any creature in the universe, tell you what to write." That was old Beanpole, and Simpson had known that he would never read a word of it. Never know if it was written, or how it was written, or if there would be anything to write. "I take it back, old Beanpole," he said aloud. "You were quite a guy." He counted the last minute aloud, holding his breath at the end, listening, waiting. Nothing happened. He squirmed, looked around at the signs again. Emergency button. Depress only if you feel extreme discomfort or if 30 minutes has elapsed. 30 minutes? Another 15 minutes just lying there? Wondering, thinking, remembering? He'd never make it. What the devil was the matter with those scientists? They were supposed to be smart. He began to feel uneasy. What if something had happened to the ship? Hit by a meteor, maybe. One of the astronomers had mentioned that. What if he was alone in space, torn loose from the ship by an explosion of some sort? Just him and his coffin, waiting 60 years for nothing. Oh, that was impossible. The mechanism would have been wrecked. He wouldn't have awakened at all. Still, something might have... He heard a click. Then another click, then a new whirring sound, stronger than the fan. A motor pulling. A new breeze swept across Munson's forehead. The signs over his chest began moving toward his feet. No, he was doing the moving. The coffin was sliding out. It had worked. After 60 years, it had worked. He was awake and he was free. Free somewhere way up in the sky on a stupid yellow star. His first thought after jumping down from the coffin was that something had gone wrong after all. The room was completely unfamiliar. It was larger than he remembered, and it was totally enclosed. He remembered windows, large, clear windows through which he had watched the crowds and had seen Old Beanpole and the buildings of the spaceport in the distance, and beyond them the whitecaps breaking along the Florida coast. Now there were only the solid walls of the spaceship. Maybe it was the pilot room he was thinking of. He ran to see, bounding high in the air because of the low gravity. He had forgotten about that. Someone had tried to explain it to him before blastoff. The ship would be made to rotate to affect an artificial gravity, but it would only be about 1/4 normal Earth gravity. Now Munson felt foolish, flailing his arms and legs in the air, waiting impatiently to come down before taking the next step. Now the pilot room was bare too, except for the master panel set against one wall. For an instant he almost went into a panic. He was positive that there had been windows, and more than one panel, and furniture. He spun around desperately. A new thought had worked its way into his brain, and he felt goose pimples gathering on his skin. Where were the other crew members? Surely some of them should have awakened by this time. He went hopping back into the morgue, as the Space Force boys had labeled it with such malicious pleasure, cursing the delay caused by his grotesque steps, having forgotten again about the low force of gravity. The coffins were just as he had left them, closed up tight, all except his own. He searched the room for directions, more printed signs, or an instruction manual. Something, for God's sake. The front of each coffin carried 2 meters and a dial. The meters were marked pulse rate and body temperature. The dials were simply marked index. All the meters read 0. The dial settings ranged from 3 to 17 on a scale of 25. Munson had no idea what index they referred to, but he knew what 0 pulse rate and 0 body temperature meant. They meant that no one else on the ship was showing the slightest tendency to awaken. He groped his way back to the pilot room and started reading the markings under the meters and switches on the master panel. Polar coordinates, Earth's perihelion. It didn't mean a thing to him. Earth distance, Ly. What was Ly? Whatever it was, there were 5 of them back to Earth. Course velocity. The dial went to 100. The needle pointed to 95. He didn't learn anything from that. Polar velocity. Same sort of dial. It read 78. View screens. At last. There was one that Cy Munson could understand. There were 3 switches. Course, destination, Earth. He flipped the switch marked Earth, then held his breath. A large square of light appeared on one wall, and shadows began dancing over the area. After a moment, the shadows stabilized, and he saw a patch of starry sky. Nothing more. No Earth, no sun, unless one of the bright stars was the sun. He had no way of knowing. Apparently, they were too far away to see Earth. Well, of course. He should have guessed that. They couldn't see any of Capella's planets from Earth, could they? Eagerly, he flipped the switch marked Destination. Another patch of light appeared. Again, he held his breath while the picture formed. He had learned one thing, and he felt better for it. The windows he had remembered had been the television screens. The streaks and shadows on the second screen stabilized, and again he saw only a starry field. He glanced back and forth from one screen to the other. The stars were in different places. More bright ones on the second screen, Munson thought. Otherwise, they were identical for all that he could see. Then, where was the one they were shooting at? That Capella? Why wasn't it blazing big and bright? And where were its 3 planets? Slowly, the realization of what had happened worked its way into his brain, and he felt a shudder run up his spine. Something had caused him to awaken prematurely. He was alone in space, trillions of miles from nowhere. He didn't know how to awaken the others, and he didn't know how to get back to sleep himself. Munson was trapped and lost and scared. Cy didn't know how long he roamed about the ship, looking for some clue, some instructions, some hope. He only knew that it had seemed like days, and that he found nothing. Nothing, that is, that would help him out of his predicament. He found a great many things, and he learned quite a lot about the ship, but he was just as much lost as before. More so, perhaps, because now he was sure of it. Munson found the other panels that he remembered. He brought them out of hiding by flipping switches on the master panel the same way he had found the television screens. But the auxiliary panels only referred to external controls, radar, radio, and flight control of the ship in atmosphere. They didn't show him what he really needed. He found relays on the master panel that would cut off the ship's oxygen pump, and other relays that would cut off the power generators. These, he assumed, had been closed automatically when he had awakened. He found a bank of 18 switches marked subliminal excitation, but he didn't know what it meant, and he didn't feel that he had the right to experiment. What if he caused the ship to deviate from its prescribed course? In 60 years, or however much time was left, the ship might become hopelessly lost in space. He found food, crates and crates of rations, all clearly marked as to which meal was inside and how many servings. There appeared to be 100% surplus over what the crew would expect to use in the 6 months on Capella 3, or wherever they landed. That meant that he had a 9-year supply without touching the basic ration. He had no way of judging the water supply. The tanks were concealed in some other part of the ship. He could only guess that the water supply would match the food supply. Anything else would be unrealistic. He had no way of guessing at the oxygen supply either, or at the heating and lighting potential. It worried him that each hour he spent in deliberation of what to do, he might be cutting off valuable living time for the other 17 men aboard. Cy Munson felt that he had gone over the ship meticulously at least 100 times, but his common sense told him that it had probably been closer to a dozen. He found no instructions for waking a man in suspended animation. He found no switches or dials or relays marked in any way to give him a clue. He hadn't even found a dictionary to help him decipher the markings that he didn't understand. He found 2 things that were not helpful. One was a sign over the bank of coffins in the morgue, which read, "It is a capital offense for anyone to touch these index dials without explicit authorization from the ship's commander." The other thing he found was a growing feeling inside him that he had no moral right to try to awaken anyone else. Suppose he was able to stir up some sort of response inside one of the coffins. He still might not be able to get it open. Or what if he got it open and the man died instead of awakening? Or what if he awoke and knew no more about what to do than Cy did? Then there would be 2 of them, and Cy Munson would be the same as a murderer. On the other hand, he might be committing murder anyway, he told himself, if he was using up too much oxygen. He had to do something, and he had to do it quick. It was last down, 2 seconds to play, and the ball was somewhere out in the middle of the field. He made one last tour of the ship, the most exhaustive search he had ever made in his life. He remembered the time he had lost a new handball that someone had given him on his 10th birthday. After looking for it hurriedly all over his grandmother's garden and tramping her flowers and weeds indiscriminately, he had then started over again, painstakingly parting each pair of stems, lifting each leaf, straightening each blade of grass, Still, he had not found the handball. He remembered that his feeling of loss had not been as great as his feeling of wonder that the handball could have escaped him. That was the way he felt now. There had to be a solution. There absolutely had to be. Even the handball, he remembered, had turned up weeks later, stuck in a gopher hole. Somewhere on this ship there's a gopher hole, he told himself over and over again. But he still didn't find it. He found the medical supplies and the hypodermic needles with which to administer the drugs, or whatever it was that they had shot into his arm. He supposed that the drug itself was somewhere there in one of the bottles, or in several of them, waiting to be mixed. It might as well have been buried in a salt mine in Siberia for the good it would do him. He found a safe with a combination dial that he spent hours trying to solve, but with no success. He found a log of the ship's activities, but there had been no entries since a few hours after blastoff. That took away his last hope. He had wondered if various crew members, or the captain maybe, were aroused periodically to examine the ship during flight. Apparently not. Munson sat down on one of the contour chairs that he had discovered folded into a compartment and fought desperately with his emotions. He was past fear now, but he was completely disgusted with himself for not having taken more interest in the ship, for not having asked more questions, for not having been bright enough to understand what they had told him. At last, the solution came to him. He fought it back as long as possible. It wasn't his fault, Munson kept telling himself. Those damn scientists. They were supposed to be smart. Finally, he couldn't postpone it any longer. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't use up any more of the ship's oxygen, nor any more of its electrical power. And he couldn't die in the ship. That would be a horrible awakening for the others, his decomposed body. He went to the cabinet where he had found the spacesuits and chose one marked large. He began studying it. After a while, he was ready to try it on. He experimented with the oxygen supply, made sure he could control it. He examined the ship's airlock for the 20th time, satisfied himself that he knew how to operate it. Then he went around the ship, returning everything to normal. He opened the oxygen relay, cut off the power generator, deactivated the television screens, replaced the auxiliary panels, and what few pieces of furniture he had used. At last, he was ready. He took one last look around, then started for the airlock. Only then did he begin to imagine the horror that awaited him. What would it be like? What would he feel drifting out away from the ship? Would he go mad? Would he live long enough to die of hunger or thirst? Or would he suffocate as his oxygen supply diminished? Without admitting to himself just what his intentions were, he went back to the medical cabinet and took out a bottle of chloroform. He had already noticed the spare connection on his space helmet, and he had remembered what the fitting on the chloroform bottle looked like. He had guessed right. It fit. Probably so anybody hurt out in space can be put to sleep on the way to the aid station, he mused aloud. Then to himself, Cy Munson added, "Well, this is going to be a long sleep." Captain Jim Halloran gradually became aware of the yellow light blinking over his chest. Then he saw the red emergency light blinking too. He struggled with his drug-induced lethargy and finally overcame it to the point where he was able to raise his forearm and press the button. During the 30 seconds while the outside chamber was being blasted with the full force of the heat engines and the oxygen pumps, he tried to shake the cobwebs from his brain. An emergency could mean any of a number of things. Some vital part of the ship could have been damaged. A short circuit could have caused a rocket to fire, resulting in an alteration of course. A stop order or change order could have been received by the automatic radio receiver. Even an invasion by an alien force was not impossible. Any creature coming in through the airlock would set off the ship's alarm. When his coffin slid out, Halloran was ready. He rolled to the floor, one hand hovering over his flame pistol, his eyes searching the morgue for some hint of trouble. He saw nothing unusual. He heard nothing unusual, and that wasn't right. He should at least have heard the whining of the heat engines as they worked at 20% overload to warm up the ship, and he should have sensed the low atmospheric pressure as the oxygen units strained to bring the chamber up to normal in 1 minute instead of the usual 15. Cautiously but quickly, he made his way toward the pilot room. Either someone or something had awakened and started up the engines, or some accident had caused them to start up by themselves. Very likely it was the latter, he thought, because just bringing the ship's interior up to normal Earth conditions would not, of itself, constitute an emergency. He found nothing wrong in the pilot room. The heat engine and oxygen pump were making some extra noise, as if they were slightly overloaded, but not much. Halloran felt a chill run up his spine. Someone had been in the ship within the past few minutes. Someone had warmed it up, opened the oxygen valve, then turned everything off again. That was the only explanation, and whoever it had been, he was gone. Otherwise, he wouldn't have turned everything off, and it couldn't have been an alien, or the emergency relay would have been tripped when he had first come in through the airlock. Someone on the ship had just left through the airlock. He glided back to the morgue, glanced quickly at the meters until he came to Cy Munson's coffin. The needles of both meters were just settling back to 0. Halloran grabbed the coffin's handles and pulled. The coffin was not sealed. It slid out into the room, empty. During the 10 seconds it took him to glide once again to the pilot room, Captain Halloran guessed what had happened. "The poor boob," he muttered half to himself. "Never should have let him come. Damn politics." He dived for the bank of switches marked Subliminal Excitation and flipped the second one from the left. "Better have the dock, too," he muttered, flipping another one further over. Then he brought down one of the viewing screens and began scanning the area around the ship. In a matter of seconds, he had spotted the spacesuit floating a few hundred yards out. He was just fastening down his space helmet when his first officer, Lieutenant Ralph DePau, staggered in from the morgue. "What the hell is going on?" DePau asked sleepily. Halloran waved in the direction of the television screen. "Tell you later," he said, clamping down on the helmet. In another moment, he was passing through the airlock. He gave himself a tremendous push with his legs as he shot out into space, then looked ahead to see if it would be sufficient. Munson was still moving away from the ship, as he would indefinitely if undisturbed. Of course, he would continue along with the ship, too, his momentum in one direction being independent of that in any other direction. Halloran had only to exceed Munson's own push, and he would catch up with him in a matter of seconds. He only hoped that it would not be too late. When he was close enough to grab Munson's spacesuit, Halloran jerked him around so he could peer in through his faceplate. Then he saw the spare hose attached to the chloroform bottle. He closed the valve, then opened the regular oxygen valve to its fullest. He began thumping Munson's arms and chest through the heavy spacesuit until he saw signs of awakening. Then he opened his repulsion nozzle and dragged Munson back to the ship. DePau and the ship's doctor were waiting for them. Halloran turned Munson over to the doctor, then went aside with DePau. "I want printed instructions pasted on the wall here and in the morgue," he said, "so nothing like this will happen again." DePau shrugged. "What language you want to print it in?" he asked sarcastically. "Baby talk?" "That's enough of that," Halloran snapped at him, bouncing out of his spacesuit. "He may not have known what to do, but it's a good thing for us he knew what not to do. There are at least a dozen ways that he could have killed us, and he didn't take a single chance. That's guts in my book, mister. That kid can fly with me anytime, anywhere, if he ever wants to try it again." An hour or so later, Cy Munson was back inside his coffin. He felt perfectly at ease this time. The doctor had explained that it had been a 1,000,000-to-1 shot that had awakened him, the combination of hard muscles that had resisted the original injection, resulting in an incomplete suspension of his life processes, but a bad connection in the subliminal excitation circuit for his coffin. "Actually, you've aged about a week in the 8 years we've been out," the doctor told him. "Maybe that doesn't seem like much, but if it hadn't been for the bad connection, you would have gone on aging until you starved to death or died of thirst. On the other hand, if you hadn't been so close to consciousness, the conditions set up by the bad connection might not have been strong enough to arouse you, and all our oxygen and electrical power might have been dissipated through your coffin. Believe me, son, unwittingly or not, you saved this expedition." The captain, too, had patted him on the back. Even Lieutenant DePau had patiently and politely explained the workings of the controls to him. Even if he did wake up again now, he would know what to do. But what pleased him most was the news that they were only 8 years out from Earth instead of the full 60. "I knew it," he said happily as he closed his eyes and waited for sleep to come again. "I knew that little Lori wasn't any 80 years old." You've been listening to pre-1990s speculative fiction readings with a highlight on science fiction by Darrell T. Smith II. Please consider clicking the donation link in the description box. Thank you so much for your time and your imagination.